Hello and welcome to Ravlic at Large. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this particular episode. Most Australians would be aware that we're currently grappling with a range of issues related to how terrorism is defined as a result of recent events here in Melbourne and elsewhere related to the Jewish community. We've seen what people call an outbreak of anti-Semitism, and along with that, there have been a range of violent incidents or incidents that incorporate some form of violence. But it's never quite sure to some people what constitutes terrorism and what doesn't. Joining me today is Deakin University Professor Greg Barton. Greg's been looking at the area for a very long time, probably longer than he wishes to remember. We'll explore some of that and look at a few issues and it related to definition and how it may be applied so you can better understand what goes on in the minds of people that are classifying these things and working with that knowledge. Greg, thanks for joining me.
Great to be with you, Tom.
Now, having introduced things the way I have, the foundational question is important, isn't it? What the hell is terrorism?
Yeah, it really is important, and it's important in a way that amuses and employs academics, but it's much more than sort of merely academic importance. It's important operationally. When police declare an operation on good basis, they have to act in good faith to be a counter-terrorism operation. It flicks a switch, triggering a whole lot of resources across agencies. So Victoria Police can work with Australian Federal Police, they'll work with ASIO, with ASIS, etc., as need be, and you get a lot more people onto a job. You can't be the boy who cried wolf. You can't say, okay, we need a lot of help with this one, so we're going to call it terrorism. If you do that, the system will break down. So you've got to act in good faith, that you believe that the violence or the attempted use of violence or threat of use of violence was intended to bring about some sort of political change, that political motive aspect. Now, politics here refers to changing society, changing the nation state. So it may be in the name of a caliphate, sort of a Islamic State type of religious fixation. It may be in the name of environmentalism. It may be the name of your white supremacist replacement theory, prejudices. But whatever, you're not just acting out of personal animus or for personal, profit. So like a criminal operation, you believe you're part of a cause and you're going to change the world.
So the integral thing that makes it, for example, an act of arson, which can happen at any point in time, the thing that would make an incident like that terrorism would be if it took place because somebody believed that was a way of furthering cause X.
That's right. So they may use the method of arson. They may deliberately drive a vehicle into pedestrians. They may hijack an aircraft. They may fire a gun. They may build an explosive device. It's not the actual sort of technical aspects that are so important. It's what they intend to do. It does need to involve violence or the threat of violence. But of course, you can imagine, in this century, we're going to see attacks that are in the cyber domain, but they nevertheless involve violence. I mean, if you shut down hospital emergency systems, that would entail violence, even though the actual action may be at the level of computer code and cyber interventions.
So we're taking it from the taking it from what you would call the physical sphere, whether it be suicide vests or the use of drones and things like that, into the IT sphere where denial of service attacks and similar can actually be terrorism if the objective is to knock things out in the name of whatever.
Yeah, most working definitions of terrorism, Tom, involve two elements. The first element is that you're using violence or threatening violence. And the second element is you're doing it because you believe you can bring about political change. There's generally, in most cases, a third qualifier which we work with, which is it's a non-state actor. That could be transnational, like Al-Qaeda or Islamic State. But it's, governments can behave very badly. Many of our governments do behave very badly. We generally call them regimes, and for good reason. We've just seen the Assad regime, which, the Assad regime killed many more people in Syria than did Islamic State. It doesn't make it better or worse by that definition. But just because we don't refer to the Assad regime's crimes always as terrorism is more to do with that definition that we're saying Islamic State, it's a non-state actor, transnational actor, using violence to bring about political change. Their name says it all. They want to have their own state. The Assad regime, working against dissent, using methods of terrifying the population. Just think of these things we've seen from the prisons around Damascus, designed, sadly, not just to terrorize, but just for the enjoyment of cruelty, it would seem. It was a psychotic situation. But if we're not calling that regime terrorist, we would say it was guilty of state terrorism. But we often don't, make that diversion. We just describe it as a barbarous, brutal, despotic regime. It's, nothing about it was good or justified. So terrorism, we can think of terrorism as kind of an adjective, and the worse something is, the more we want to use it. That's a clumsy way of employing the word.
If we go back to 2014 and the creation of the caliphate in and around Syria and Iraq, ISIS was and still is regarded as a terrorist organization, right? What happens when ISIS creates a state? How do we define the entity?
That's a very good question. We have with the case of ISIS, we were never in any doubt ourselves that the so-called Islamic State caliphate was, part of a terrorist project. We need to understand motivation in people joining a group. So the fact that many people traveled to Syria to join what they saw as a utopian project doesn't justify what they did, but it helps us understand the power of attraction, and it helps us better understand how to interrupt that. In the case of Afghanistan, we clearly have a group that within Taliban that very closely then and still aligned with Al-Qaeda. Going back to the 9/11 attacks, it wasn't the Taliban that carried out the attacks, but Al-Qaeda did it from Taliban territory. When the Taliban marched into Kabul 3 years ago, and now have a regime, a government in Afghanistan, there's a temptation not to call it terrorism and to sort of split hairs and say, well, it's the state, it's running the country, it's not wanting to attack anyone outside the country, it's not good, we don't like it, but we're not calling it terrorism. I think that could be interrogated a whole lot further. This was a terrorist group. It still behaves in a terrorist group manner to the way it treats half the Afghan population, women, and many of the men. There's a good case for saying that we have a terrorist regime in Afghanistan running the state, and it's certainly harboring many terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, which are its guests, and like Islamic State in Khorasan province, which is its rival, but nevertheless exists because of what it's done. So I think we need to recognize that terms and definitions evolve out of historical context, and when historical context change, we need to think about first principles, but we're not always very good about that when it comes to terrorism.
Before we go on to what's happened in Australia just recently, how useful is the term terrorism more generally? I mean, you focus on it a lot given your work. I've certainly done enough looking at it to understand where it's come from and why we are where we are. But how useful is it in the context of labeling things?
It's very useful operationally. So it's very useful in terms of, it's mainly counterterrorism is mainly a police operation, and police-led counterterrorism has as its aim detection and disruption. It wants to stop terrorism happening, but then because it's police and because you're dealing with crimes, you need prosecution. Prosecution, if something hasn't yet happened, involves proving that people were planning to do something. So our laws say that preparations for an act of terrorism or support of a terrorist group, that's terrorism. That presents challenges in the courtroom, but I think we have to pay that price, that we put a lot of resources into weighing up evidence and considering verdicts, because the benefits of detecting and disrupting are enormous. Our various military operations over the last 2 decades have verged from being somewhat useful to completely disastrous in producing unintended consequences. Think of Afghanistan and Iraq in particular. But what the flip side is that police forces around the world, not just in Western democracies, I'm thinking of Indonesia, a very successful counterterrorism, police forces have learnt how to use intelligence to detect people planning a terrorist attack and disrupt it. And that's really good. I mean, there's no, like so many things in life, we only appreciate, well, we can see when something's happening, when something bad happens, and we don't necessarily appreciate it when it's being prevented. But if we know what the details of how it works, then, if somebody that, like me, that is spending time studying this appreciates that we're saved from a lot of grief because of work that's done quietly by most people whose names we don't know and whose actions we don't see. But nevertheless, it's really important to keep on doing what they do. It's easy with the public to criticize this sort of work and say it's all a political instrument and it's a hog on resources and can't be justified. But if you know what's going on, you see that actually definitionally having a definition of terrorism, understanding how it works, knowing how to detect people planning, joining a group, detecting that, and then disrupting them from doing something bad, that's really important.
One of the things I have noticed, and you no doubt have picked up on it as well, given some of the commentary that's been around the place, is when we move out of the context that you and I have spoken about terrorism, that is a very clinical use of the term, it means something related to individuals or groups that are planning or are undertaking a violent, undertaking something that incorporates violence in the name of a cause. When it starts to get used colloquially, it gets a bit messy, doesn't it?
It does, but that's not a defense of not trying to do the right thing with our terms and be disciplined and trying to educate people about why that discipline is important. I mean, there's lots of things in life that get messy in colloquial usage, and that can have really devastating consequences. We can cover up for some very bad crimes by dismissing it as just normal behavior. So we are more aware than ever, I think, probably in history, that many men behave badly, particularly with respect to women, but often with respect to people that have less power than them and they're in their care. And we have a serious problem with domestic violence in Australia, serious problem with sexual abuse of children, of assault of men on women, but it can be more complicated than that. And if we sort of cover it up by saying, well, that's just, he's just being a bloke, it's just what happens, then we're covering up terrible crimes and abuses. And for a long time, we didn't listen to kids in a religious institution who had been abused because we said, you've got to trust the father or the priest or the pastor, whatever it was. So, that's just to say that just because it's difficult to talk about some things and we fall back on reflex doesn't mean it's worth, we're not being super woke here, Tom, by, fussing about definitions and calling things what they are. It's actually really important to protect people.
If in the colloquial setting, it is also possible for people to call something terrorism and it ends up not being terrorism.
Absolutely, yeah. No, and of course our first reaction often we see something terrible happen. We've had some good examples this year, 2024, which are helpful for us in Australia to locate our thinking about this. So Bondi Junction, we had a man who went wild, literally having a psychotic episode with a knife, stabbing multiple people, killing some. Thankfully, staff at the Bondi Junction Mall, the retail centre, had done training on how to respond to incidents in public spaces, and they took their customers and they locked them away safely, and they probably saved many lives. So that's a sort of reminder that this sort of training for things that we think are unlikely but can happen it can be very important. At the time, it was tempting to say the guy's a terrorist. I mean, it sort of looks like terrorism, and the people were terrified. The impact was terrible. Why split hairs over whether we call it terrorism? Well, because motivation and intent's important. When we understand the tragic story that this man had serious mental health issues, wasn't on his regular medication. Had he been on his medication, he would have been fine, but he was homeless and therefore wasn't seeing a doctor. His parents had tried to help. Tragically, they weren't able to stop it. It's a real tragedy, but the pathways to preventions and the lessons to be learned in that case involve different mechanisms, different issues than with terrorism. And then, around the same time, we had a case with a young man who may also have had some mental health issues, but nevertheless, according to his own statements, stabbed a Syrian Orthodox archbishop. Fortunately, no one died. He made certain statements at the time that were recorded on video. Later on, he was arrested and spoke to police. Police decided very quickly that, based on what he was saying, he believed that this young man believed he was acting in the name of a political cause. He was trying to change things. Of course, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Syrian people, come from a part of the world that was roughly contiguous with or overlapping with the Islamic State Caliphate area, and therefore you could sort of understand how in this young man's mind he thought he was striking out a cause for Islamic State and such groups against Christians. But tragic all around, and there may be a mental health issue involved in it. But the clear statement of intent, the clear sort of motivation. And having said all this, though, Tom, that it still has to go to court, and the court may decide that based on what they hear, this young man was so disturbed and so confused that they don't feel a terrorism charge is appropriate. But the fact that police within hours were calling it a terrorism investigation operationally makes perfect sense.
If we look at the more recent goings on in Australia, what concerns would you have, given your expertise and background, about the way we're having a conversation about whether an act in in Melbourne or in Sydney constitutes terrorism? Are there things that you and I having this discussion right now can help people reflect on?
Yeah, I think there's certain things we need to be very clear about, and then we need to sort of try and learn what lessons we can. So, a larger context of us speaking now in December 2024 is that on October 7th, 2023, Hamas, which is widely regarded for good reason as a terrorist organization, launched an awful attack. They broke through the confines of the Gaza Strip, and the security barriers were meant to keep them inside the Gaza Strip. They launched a terrorist attack that was obscenely cruel and provocative, and it was not accidentally so. It was designed to provoke a response from the state of Israel and amplify what they were doing. Just as when the World Trade Center towers came down on the 11th of September 2001, it was not just a terrible symbolic act. It was designed to provoke a response. In that case, of course, the response greatly amplified the attack that Al-Qaeda had taken place. Israel, in that case, of course, has a right to defend itself, but also, you'd argue, an obligation to defend itself and look after its people. A lot of the debate since has been whether what Israel has done has really made Israelis safer, or whether there's in excesses that are alleged, war crimes that are alleged, in fact, it's actually, in the longer term, undermining Israeli security. I'm mentioning it as a background, but the Friday of last week, when we had a terrible arson attack on a synagogue in Melbourne, the day before, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi Netanyahu, had been critical of Australia's vote in the UN, along with 157 other nations, voting to say that Israel should take steps to move towards a two-state solution, explore a political solution, and withdraw from the West Bank territories. And the Prime Minister of Israel said, in doing that, Australia is encouraging terrorism. The next day, of course, there was an arson attack, and people joined those two things together. And in Australian federal politics, we've had this, I think, rather unseemly debate or series of accusations cast around that to be critical of Netanyahu's government in Israel is somehow to endorse terrorism, and the current Australian government bears culpability for endorsing terrorism. I think all of that is unfortunate, because none of it, I think, is objectively true. There's fair points to be made on all sides, and we need to hear each other and understand the concerns. And the nation of Israel is living through terrible trauma still since the October 7th attacks. We could have lots of debates about intention and cause and effect, etc. But of course, none of that in any way excuses, justifies the use of violence against any group, and it certainly doesn't excuse the rising anti-Semitism we're seeing in Australia, which is clearly documented, and it certainly doesn't justify attacks on Jewish members of Parliament and the parliamentary offices, or of course this firebombing of a synagogue is about one of the most horrible things we can think of, except that no one died, thankfully, but it could easily have had lives lost depending on the timing of that event. People could have been at prayer and not been able to escape before being overcome by smoke. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But that's the context of what we're talking about: a shocking event, one that really traumatizes a traumatized community. Of course, there's emotional language. Of course, there's a desire to stop it from happening. For me, I think one of the pities of what's going on is that we've long had a good system in Australia of bipartisan support for security issues, including counterterrorism. And it's a pity that it sort of appears now to be a live issue when it comes into a season that's going into a federal election campaign. So I don't think that's constructive to anyone involved. I don't think it really helps. But that's another thing.
Those of us that have read the literature understand the history of the terminology, understand the broad nature of the discipline, and also can look at this somewhat dispassionately and break the components apart. Is there anything that people watching these events from outside can reflect on and do themselves to better understand the dynamics they're seeing at play, so it becomes not so much a less of a shock, but there's a greater awareness of how these things play out?
I think actually there's a lot that we can do, Tom. It's a coincidence, but days before these recent developments, we had a report released by the Five Eyes intelligence community, and that includes for us, Five Eyes, of course, Australia, New Zealand, UK, Canada, US, going back to World War II and intelligence alliances. We had a document released where they'd collaborated in police counterterrorism research and intelligence agency research, and they were particularly concerned about young people being radicalized, particularly in an online space. And so the earlier incident we discussed about the stabbing of the Assyrian archbishop sort of fits that pattern of concern. In fact, they mentioned that in the last 4 years, the police in Australia have investigated 35 cases as counterterrorism cases, largely involving minors, young teenagers, and that all of the cases investigated this year in 2024 have involved very young people, most of them teenagers under the age of 18. So that's a steady trend change, which is very concerning. I think the reason for releasing the report, it was explained, was, and I don't think this was a great exercise in communications, by the way. I think it was a lost opportunity, which is a pity because I think the intentions were good. But the intention was in part to say to the public, and police made this statement very clearly, by the time we get involved in a criminal investigation, it's often too late to prevent harm. We may stop a terrorist attack, but the young people involved will have their lives damaged, if not destroyed, their families, their communities, etc. Much better if we can get involved earlier on, because we're dealing with young people who may end up being perpetrators, but start off as victims of exploitation, of grooming, of recruitment, often online. And if we can detect the early warning signs that somebody's trying to influence them, we can step in earlier. And by the way, that means you can get police help, but the police don't make it a criminal case. They bring in a child psychologist, they sit and talk, try and understand what's going on, and then try and work out a plan to stop something worse happening, and no criminal charges necessarily are laid. So we actually have good systems in Australia, particularly in Victoria and New South Wales, to do that. I don't think we're very good at explaining them. I don't think the exercise last week did a very good job of pointing us in the right direction. One piece of evidence in support of this statement is that the report had various links, hypertext links to where you could go to get help, and half of the ones I checked were broken. So it was a bit of a clumsy exercise, but the intention was good. And it so happens that, in this last week, we've had a whole lot of developments that have sort of reminded us that terrorism is a live issue and it's not going away. But to your question, parents, teachers, people working with young people can look out for warning signs that they're being groomed, perhaps online, and radicalized. Radicalization is a social process. It involves somebody befriending somebody, persuading them that they're acting in their interest, that they admire them, and that they want to bring them into a special group. Very attractive message for any human being, but particularly for a lonely young teenager. Most people, if they're not teenagers, are in their 20s when they're radicalized. So this is a young person's thing. Secondly, we can prepare to respond to incidents. It's very hard to anticipate a lone actor attack. We can, if we listen to what people are saying, often hear them talking about their intentions to do something. That's called leakage, and we can use that to move in and stop something bad happening. And before that, we can see early warning signs of radicalization. But let's supposing we miss those things, which often happens. The Bondi Junction attack I referred to was not a terrorist attack because of motivation and intent. Nevertheless, when somebody's running through a mall with a knife, you don't know what their motivation. In some ways, it doesn't matter at that point. It's how you respond. And the retail sales workers and others in the centre responded really bravely. So did, unfortunately, some young security officers, including 2 Pakistani men, one of whom lost his life in trying to save others. It's the full range of human tragedy in this. But there is the bright side, which is that because people had done exercises in safety in public places, the training kicked in, they pulled down barriers, they kept customers safe, and I'm sure lives were saved. So it's a reminder it's not hopeless, and we can prepare even for attacks that we don't see coming, prepare to respond if we see something happening. I think probably most importantly, though, watch out for the loved ones in our lives, and if we think something's going wrong with them in terms of sort of changes across their expressed ideology, their behavior, their friendships, seek help to see whether there's not somebody else in their life trying to unfortunately manipulate them and exploit them. So that was what the police were calling for and still are calling for, and there's a lot we can do in that space. So it really is important that we pay attention. Back in the days of 9/11, one of our responses was little messages on magnets on our fridges saying, be alert but not alarmed, which is hard to argue with. Who can say we shouldn't be alert but not alarmed? Once again, the intention was good, the communications wasn't so good. Now we can honestly say, if you see something happening to a loved one and have concerns, speak up and get help, because there are systems in place that can swing in around them, and hopefully we prevent any criminal charges, much less any criminal acts.
One of the things that we might point out before we finish, and you've been extremely generous with your time, Greg, is that there's also publications that are available freely, like the one that I'm just showing now, Defining Terrorism by Alex Schmidt from the International Centre for Counter-Terrorism. Those things are available freely online, and they're particularly good if you don't want to pick up a copy of the Terrorism Research Handbook, which is a little bit more weighty than...
Most of us probably don't want to do that, and I wouldn't recommend it. Go looking around to go deep into academic literature.
No, but the point being, there are some good resources that are accessible. They're not that long. There are even papers looking at the origins of what QAnon is from back in 2021. The one that comes to mind is about 5 pages long. Is the paper written by Sophia Moskalenko and Clark Macaulay in a very compact fashion. It discusses some complex theory, but it does it really, really well. Greg, is there any... You do a lot of work at Deakin in this space. Where can people go to learn more about the sort of work you do and your team members there in the Avert network?
Okay, you mentioned the Avert network, which is a research network that has a number of Deakin and Alfred Deakin Institute members, but also we have colleagues across Australia and other universities and beyond universities, and a lot of practitioners as well. So it's the Avert Research Network, and I should know the URL off the top of my head, but avertres.net, I think. I think we'll put some links in the show notes and make it clear, but the Avert Research Network. I'm not saying that everything we do is going to be wonderfully lucid and accessible for public consumption, but we do try to have opinion pieces. I wrote a piece recently in The Conversation, for example, a couple of days ago, trying to explain definitions of terrorism and how police make decisions. Perhaps more importantly, too, there are places you can go to that have really good information on how to look out for early warning signs. I mean, one of the groups we've worked with in Melbourne is called the Australian Multicultural Foundation, and at amf.net, you find some e-training about early warning signs that somebody's been radicalised. And the Australian government, particularly the Department of Home Affairs and their Living Safely Together program, if you Google that, has documents and sort of brief explainers saying, here's early warning signs of radicalisation, here's things you can do. All of that sounds a bit complicated, I know. And so I would say one last thing, and that is that if you have a concern about a young person in your life and you discreetly make approaches through your local police, They will put you onto proper resources. They won't kick your door down and arrest your son or daughter. They can arrange a child psychologist or somebody else to appropriately assess and say, thankfully, we don't think this is radicalization, but we do think it's another problem. Or, yes, we do think there's something we need to be in further talks. And the whole idea is to prevent anything bad happening, including criminal charges, which are damaging themselves. So we have good resources in place in Australia. All across our state police, there are people whose job it is to help the public. They don't make a song and dance about it, Tom, partly because when they're helping families, they don't talk about the family's name. They don't put the spotlight, even within their own community, on them, because that's counterproductive. I think that's one good thing that came out of the wave of radicalization and recruitment with Islamic State. Islamic State declared their caliphate at the end of July 2014. We then realized that for the 2 years prior, kids from Australia had been traveling to Syria, but mostly via Turkey. And over the 2 years that followed, there were a lot of young people who tried to leave Australia to go and join this, what they saw as utopian project, and they were stopped because of very good work coordinated with state and federal police. And I think that taught a lesson that, when you may not like the idea of police poking around your family business, but when you risk losing a child, and there's some terrible stories of parents waking up to find that their kids have disappeared, never coming back, then you really do want help. And I think we've built confidence through that difficult experience.
I've been talking to Greg Barton from Deakin University, looking at what terrorism is and how our institutions help to try and prevent bad things from happening. Greg, thank you so much for giving up your time this afternoon.
It's been a pleasure, and it's a really worthwhile topic to talk about, Tom.
Yep. And thank you for joining me. There'll be another episode of Ravlic at Large on LinkedIn and YouTube at some stage in the next little while. Keep an eye out for it, and thank you for watching.